Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us today. My name is Mireya Solis. I'm the Director of the Center for Asia Policy Studies at Brookings. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program, China's Influence in the Pacific Islands, Overstatement or Underestimation. Today's webinar is very timely. The Pacific Islands Forum Leaders Meeting just wrapped up last week, and we'll have therefore an opportunity to discuss the most recent developments. But I want to emphasize that we will also be talking about long-term trends. And this is possible because what makes this event very unique is that we will feature, the presentation of the exhaustive work that Joanne Wallis has done over several years to map the presence and influence of different external actors in the Pacific Islands, such as China, Australia, and the United States. And she has done it through extensive fieldwork and with a keen eye on how Pacific Island countries are themselves navigating the current era of geostrategic competition. Joanne is a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings and professor of international security and director of the Security in the Pacific Islands Research Program at the University of Adelaide in Australia. Joanne leads several research projects on the Pacific Islands on topics such as Pacific Maritime Security Cooperation and the operation of the Australia-New Zealand Alliance in the Pacific Islands. She has done exhaustive data visualization work, mapping the tools of statecraft in the Pacific Islands, and is co-author of the 2024 book, Gird by Sea, Reimagining Australia's Security. I'm also thrilled that following Joanne's presentation, we will hear from two excellent discussants. Catherine Pack is Deputy Director and Senior Fellow with Australia Chair at CSIS. Catherine served in the United States Marine Corps for 23 years, most recently as the Director for Southeast Asia and the Pacific on the National Security Council, where she spearheaded the creation of the first U.S.-Pacific Partnership Strategy and the initial U.S.-Pacific Islands Forum Summit. And my colleague Patricia Kim, who is a fellow at Brookings, and she is an expert on Chinese foreign policy, U.S.-China relations, and the politics and security of East Asia. Patty co-leads the Global China Project at Brookings. So with that, let me turn the virtual floor to Joanne. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you everybody for joining us today. So as you've heard, I'm going to talk about China's influence in the Pacific Islands region. And to begin, to give you some context, in April 2018, it was reported that China was in talks to build a military base in Vanuatu. Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull quickly responded that Australia would view with great concern the establishment of any foreign military bases in those Pacific Island countries and neighbours of ours. Those concerns grew after the 2019 news that Solomon Islands and Kiribati had switched their diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China, and escalated after it was reported that China had sought to lease Tulangi Island in Solomon Islands, which was home to a Second World War Japanese naval base, and to upgrade a strategically located airstrip that had hosted military aircraft during the Second World War on Canton Island in Kiribati. These concerns became anxiety in April 2022 when Solomon Islands signed a security agreement with China. Although the final agreement has never been published, some analysts interpreted a leaked draft as paving the way for a Chinese military base. The reason for this anxiety is that the Pacific Islands region is strategically vital to Australia. It lies across some of our most important air and sea approaches. The Japanese advance during the Second World War illustrated how effectively a hostile power could use the islands as stepping stones. The Northern Pacific Islands are also critical to the United States defence. In this presentation, I'm going to analyse the different elements of China's attempts to exercise influence in the Pacific Islands region. And on each slide, you'll see pictures of the different reports and publications that this draws upon. Before we start, we need to acknowledge that strategic competition has created structural incentives for Pacific countries to leverage the interests of partners to advance their own developmental priorities. China is one of an array of partners that are offering benefits that Pacific actors are quite rationally accepting. China has calculated that, given the small size of Pacific countries, it can generate a high level of strategic anxiety in Australia, the US, and others for a relatively low amount of spending in the region. Despite claims that China's second island chain of defence includes the Micronesian sub-region, with the southern Melanesian sub-region and part of the eastern Polynesian sub-region in the third island chain, it is questionable whether the Pacific Islands region is really that strategically important to China. The US's military presence in the Northern Pacific means that it would be very difficult for China to establish a useful military presence in the Pacific Islands region. And any Chinese military base would be unpopular in the host Pacific Island country. Logistics and supply lines would be expensive, and the base would be extremely vulnerable in the event of, for example, a conflict in Northeast Asia. Any military benefit for China of a base in the Southern Pacific will diminish further once Australia acquires nuclear-powered submarines under the AUKUS partnership. Now, this is not to say that Australia, the US, and others do not have legitimate strategic interests in seeking to minimise China's role in the Pacific. There are plenty of other ways that China can generate strategic challenges. For example, if the Chinese maritime militia becomes more active in the region, using tactics that it's developed in the South China Sea to test the maritime sovereignty of Pacific countries or to interfere with shipping lanes, this could have significant consequences. Not only would it raise questions about Australia's capacity to act as the region's primary security partner, but it would also be politically costly for our government, which has made explicit its concerns about China and its intent to pursue a strategy of denial in the region. Diplomatic presence can help China to familiarise itself with Pacific actors and identify potential influence targets. China has embassies in 8 of the 11 Pacific Island countries with which it maintains diplomatic recognitions. Australia has diplomatic posts in all Pacific countries, followed closely by New Zealand. While there is some value in the quantity of diplomatic presence, as my Pacific colleagues have discussed in one of the reports that is pictured, relationships are the enduring currency of influence in the Pacific, and it is the quality of individual diplomats that determines whether diplomatic presence translates into influence. This highlights that Pacific actors are not passive subjects. Chinese influence attempts are mediated by their Pacific targets, each of whom has specific identities and interests and is located in complex political and socioeconomic structures. Beyond diplomacy, China seeks to build people-to-people links to socialise Pacific actors to its views, attitudes and preferences. I've included a screenshot of our statecraftiness story map where you can access interactive data relating to all the tools of statecraft that China and other Pacific partner countries deploy in the Pacific except for aid and loans. China offers scholarship programs, but so does Australia, Japan, New Zealand, Taiwan, the US and the UK. There are large numbers of Chinese migrants in many Pacific countries, but they are a very diverse group. Some have been in the region for generations and are well integrated. There are even politicians with Chinese heritage. Others are more recent arrivals, and it is this group that demonstrates that presence does not necessarily positively contribute to China's influence. Often these newer migrants are perceived to dominate the private sector, particularly retail, which can generate local resentment. We saw this boil over into riots in Solomon Islands and Tonga in 2006. This highlights that China is not a unitary actor and a diverse range of Chinese actors operate in the Pacific. This can make it difficult to identify how much their activities are linked to the Chinese state. While few Australians migrate to the Pacific, there are a lot of Australian volunteers in the region. Australia, New Zealand and the US also have other people-to-people links that are largely unavailable to China. For example, our churches have long-standing connections in the strongly Christian region. We also have established sporting and cultural links. And Australia and New Zealand both have Pacific labour mobility schemes, while citizens of the compact states can live and work in the United States. It's common for analysts to mention China's aid as a tool of influence and potential interference in the Pacific. While aid can be a positive tool of inducement and threatening to withdraw aid can be a negative one, China's aid must be analysed relative to other major donors, not in absolute terms. As the graph indicates, Australia has long been by far the largest donor. New Zealand and the US have also long provided more aid than China when we look at what is implemented rather than just what is announced. The type of aid that China gives is also important. It has shifted to providing more direct government budget transfers, including to Solomon Islands' controversial Constituency Development Fund and Kiribatis' Social Stability Fund. Now, direct budget transfers are something that Australia stopped doing in the 1990s because of concerns about fiscal management. However, we too have recently restarted this approach. Where aid is targeted is also important, and there are claims that China is being more strategic, directing aid to countries like Kiribati and Solomon Islands to secure diplomatic recognition. China has also shifted to a small but beautiful model of aid delivery, with embassies delivering highly flexible and locally targeted grants, such as vehicles, agricultural equipment, or cash. These donations can have tangible and immediately visible community impacts. You will undoubtedly have heard prominent analysts warn that Chinese lending, particularly through the Belt and Road Initiative, could lead to debt trap diplomacy, whereby China could use its lending to secure access to key resources or potential military facilities such as ports or airstrips if debtor states cannot service their loans. While these claims have largely been debunked by research, loans can act as both positive and negative inducements. As you'll see from the graph, China was the region's largest lender until 2019. The loans made by Japan, New Zealand, and the US were so low that they aren't even really visible on the graph. But as you will also see, Australia has replaced China as the region's largest lender as the Australian Infrastructure Financing Facility for the Pacific develops momentum. The data indicates a drop in Chinese lending from 2018 onwards, which reflects a general decline in Chinese BRI lending. This drop has impacted Chinese construction companies, which have increasingly had to rely on multilateral financial institutions or host government funding. And this has encouraged these Chinese companies to underbid for infrastructure projects. It means that it's increasingly common for Chinese companies to realise a project isn't viable and then to seek to try to renegotiate their contracts partway through. It also highlights why it's important to acknowledge that the quantity of Chinese activity does not necessarily relate to quality or to its effectiveness in generating influence. For example, much Chinese-built infrastructure is poor quality and China seldom provides funding for ongoing maintenance. Chinese investment has grown since 2006, when Premier Wen Jiabao convened the first China-Pacific Island countries Economic Development and Cooperation Forum in Fiji and signalled that finance was available to Chinese state-owned enterprises. As you can see from the top graph, China's foreign direct investment goes to only a few countries, particularly Samoa. After I remove Samoa from the data, the bottom graph makes it slightly easier to see where other Chinese investment is going. But the degree of connection between Chinese companies and the Chinese government differs. Some companies have strong political links and actively seek to advance the Chinese government's interests, but many others operate primarily to make a profit. Few Pacific countries are highly dependent on China for trade opportunities. China takes half of Solomon Islands' exports and is by a narrow margin Papua New Guinea's largest export destination. But China is not even among the top 5 trading partners of many other Pacific Island countries. However, China has used tourism as a negative inducement to interfere in, for example, Palau, where it warned Chinese tourism operators off and caused a contraction in Palau's economy. As I mentioned, some analysts interpreted the 2022 China-Solomon Islands Security Agreement as paving the way for a permanent Chinese military presence. The Solomon Islands government denies this and nothing has eventuated. So apart from sending its ships through the region and occasional port visits, China does not have a military presence. But China has created several initiatives that may have military components in the future. The China-Pacific Island Countries Reserve for Emergency Supplies, the China-Pacific Island Countries Climate Change Cooperation Centre, and the China-Pacific Island Countries Centre for Disaster Risk Reduction and Cooperation. But these are all based in China and have only limited engagement with Pacific countries. They are also secondary to Pacific regional initiatives, including the Australian-backed Pacific Response Group that was established in 2024. There are reports that China might be starting to send its Coast Guard into the region, which raises questions about its powers of interdiction, particularly if it strays into Pacific EEZs. Australia and the US have agreements with Pacific countries covering this, but China does not. But we can set all China's activity against the military presence of Australia, the US, and their allies and partners. Australia has a defence presence in every independent Pacific country through its Pacific Maritime Security Program, through which it provides patrol boats to help Pacific countries manage their extensive maritime domains. Australia is also upgrading wharf infrastructure in 13 Pacific countries and has redeveloped the Lomram Naval Base on Manus Island in Papua New Guinea in cooperation with the Papua New Guinean and US governments. Australia's Defence Cooperation Program has also provided infrastructure projects, military and other security assistance and training across the region for decades. We also regularly conduct exercise with our Pacific counterparts. Australia is also the major provider of humanitarian and disaster relief, often with New Zealand's support, and New Zealand does also provide defence assistance. The United States has an extensive military presence, particularly in the Northern Pacific. Guam, a US territory, hosts Joint Region Marianas and Marine Camp Blas. The Second World War era airfield on Tinian Island in the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands, which is another US territory, which was the base for nuclear bombers during the Second World War, is also being upgraded, along with the construction of new combat support and training facilities. The Republic of Marshall Islands, which the US has a compact of free association with, hosts the Ronald Reagan Ballistic Missile Defence Test Site. In another compact state, the Republic of Palau, the US is installing the Tactical Multi-Mission Over-the-Horizon Radar Transmitter Facility and repairing the Second World War era Japanese airfield. The US is also proposing to upgrade an airfield on Yap in the third compact state, the Federated States of Micronesia, to provide a divert and contingency airfield for US defence assets. Under the compact agreements, the US is entitled to operate military bases and make decisions relating to compact states' external security. France also has a substantial military base in its territory of New Caledonia. It's worth mentioning China's attempt in early 2022 to secure regional support for a joint communique and 5-year action plan covering security, political and economic cooperation. That plan was rejected by Pacific leaders on the ground that there had been no consultation or opportunity to reach regional consensus. While China did succeed in signing 50 bilateral agreements, none of these appear to have had a substantial security focus. In February this year, China signed a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement with the Cook Islands. And although the agreement does not specifically cover security, it covers investment in ports, which analysts have claimed could become dual-use facilities. Cook Islands is in a relationship of free association with New Zealand, and it is likely that the agreement is primarily about Prime Minister Mark Brown making a point to New Zealand about achieving greater independence for Cook Islands than it is about giving China a strategic foothold. It's also worth remembering the range of bilateral security agreements Australia has signed with Pacific countries, as well as its Whalepili Union Treaty that has created an alliance with Tuvalu, our treaty with Nauru, and the treaty that we're about to sign with Papua New Guinea. And of course, there's also the Muta Treaty now with Fiji. China has had more success attempting to police deployments and assistance in the Pacific. The physical presence of police can help China to gather intelligence and understand the security needs and preferences of Pacific governments. Police can be a tool for interference if they're used as a positive inducement to prop up a Pacific government in the event of unrest. They can also operate as a negative inducement if they undermine a government. In 2011, China signed an MOU with Fiji on police cooperation, which facilitated police exchanges and secondments, as well as the provision of Chinese equipment. The relationship facilitated several extraditions of suspected Chinese criminals from Fiji. While the new Fijian government questioned the arrangement in 2023, it has decided to let it remain in place, although it hasn't stopped embedding Chinese police. Elsewhere, China has provided infrastructure and equipment to police in Samoa, Cook Islands, Vanuatu and Papua New Guinea. Small numbers of Chinese police have also been involved in training in Kiribati and Vanuatu. But in March 2024, Papua New Guinea rejected a policing agreement with China. China has held 3 ministerial dialogues on police capacity building and cooperation, but only 7 Pacific countries attended the last meeting in September 2024. After the November 2021 riots in Solomon Islands, China deployed a 9-person police liaison team in January 2022, and that team later grew to 12 members. After a China-Solomon Islands policing agreement was signed in 2023, the deployment of Chinese police doubled for the Pacific Games, which Solomon Islands hosted in October 2023 and grew to 30 during the 2024 elections. In addition to that liaison team signing an MOU with their Solomon Islands counterparts, a leaked draft of the 2022 security agreement contained a clause that permits China to deploy more police or military forces to protect the safety of Chinese personnel in major projects. And this highlighted China's emerging preference for its police to be involved in protecting Chinese projects and policing the Chinese diaspora. Against all this, we need to remember the overwhelming presence of Australian police and policing assistance. Australian police or other security officials are involved in every regional policing initiative. And last year, we also announced the Pacific Policing Initiative, and we provide extensive bilateral policing assistance. New Zealand, the US, Japan, and other partners are also active in providing policing assistance. Beyond these material aspects of China's efforts in the Pacific, it's been engaged in socialisation attempts via the media. After creating and analysing a database of Chinese and English language sources, a member of my team identified three main narratives that China attempts to spread. First, a shared historical story of colonial oppression. Second, a narrative of South-South cooperation. And third, that the BRI is needed and desirable. But our study highlighted the importance of acknowledging the agency of Pacific actors. Members of my team from Fiji, Samoa, and Solomon Islands analysed the speeches and other government documents of each country in both English and the local language to identify whether and how these Chinese narratives had been adopted. We found that while these countries have been receptive to Chinese lending and investment, they have been far less receptive to its narratives. Instead, the leaders of these countries have selectively and instrumentally adopted Chinese narratives to advance their own interests. This highlights how China's influence efforts are not unilinear. Indeed, in another study, we identified how Pacific countries have used their Blue Pacific narrative to influence their partner states' policies. Beyond cultivating narrative, China has reportedly tried to use donations to Pacific news organisations as positive inducements to secure stories that promote China. Balanced against this, it is overwhelmingly Australian or New Zealand content, particularly from our state broadcasters, the ABC and RNZ, that is republished by Pacific news outlets. Chinese media is broadcast via subscription Sky Pacific Digital TV, and in a few countries, the 24-hour English language service of CCTV International is broadcast, as is Chinese International Radio. Again, set against this is the ABC Radio Australia, is broadcast in every Pacific country, as is ABC Australia TV and Pacific Oz TV. We also need to keep in mind patterns of Pacific media consumption. For the State of the Media Pacific project that my team conducted for ABC International Development last year, we found that very few people have access to television or newspapers beyond urban centres. While newspapers' websites are more broadly accessible, the challenges of literacy and reliable internet means that their readership is relatively low. Most people rely on radio and they overwhelmingly prefer broadcasts in local languages. Our survey and interview respondents also reported that the ABC, along with RNZ and TVNZ, were by far the most trusted external media broadcasters. And notably, both the ABC and RNZ regularly broadcast in local languages. Beyond traditional media, social media is an increasingly popular mechanism for China and other partners to try to socialise specific audiences to their views and values. Our ABC ID project found that Facebook is the most popular social media platform. To try to understand the effectiveness of social media as a tool of socialisation, we analysed social media followings of diplomatic missions for our statecraftiness story map. China's diplomatic missions have very low social media followings. Australia and the US are overwhelmingly the two most popular. Having said this, social media engagement does not necessarily indicate that people agree with or even think favourably of that country. For example, the large following of the US Embassy in Papua New Guinea could be due to interest in the controversial 2023 US-PNG Defence Cooperation Agreement. Beyond official government social media pages, there are claims that Chinese, Russian and Indonesian actors have spread disinformation via social media. This was a particular challenge during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly relating to vaccines. However, expert respondents reported during our ABC ID research that in societies as small as most Pacific countries, people have a good understanding of individual journalists and their connections. False reporting is therefore quickly refuted. Finally, elites in several Pacific countries are vulnerable to co-option and corruption because low levels of economic development makes offers of cash or other initiatives attractive. Unfortunately, anti-corruption mechanisms and enforcement is generally weak across the region. Elite co-option, though, remains understudied beyond rumours, and I point you here to the 2 seasons of our Statecraftiness podcast, in which we heard from Pacific actors directly about how they navigate being on the receiving end of these co-option and corruption attempts. So what does this all mean for Australia and the US? First, we need to recognise that strategic competition has created structural conditions which mean that Australia, the US and our allies and partners will perceive the activities of any power with potentially malign interests in the Pacific as threatening. Second, Pacific leaders are, for the most part, acting rationally. Strategic competition incentivizes small, resource-poor Pacific countries to leverage the interests of partners to advance their developmental priorities. Wealthy Western countries can't expect Pacific countries to forego opportunities that we ourselves take advantage of, including economic links to China. Australia has and continues to make significant investments to counter China's efforts at achieving influence in the Pacific. The cuts to US spending in the region have left serious gaps, which Australia has attempted to fill, but which are unsustainable in the long term if the US is serious about its strategic interests in the region. But at the same time, we do need to avoid creating a spending and lending arms race in the Pacific. We shouldn't overread the implications of China's activities, nor should we underestimate the importance of Pacific Actors Agency and Pacific Island countries' national interests. We need to remember that geopolitics, like all politics, is ultimately about people. My Pacific colleagues regularly remind me that Pacific people want to feel Australians, and I imagine it's the same for Americans. Spending is all well and good, but our most important tool of influence is our people and the connections and understanding that they can build with our Pacific neighbours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanne. That was just terrific. What a comprehensive overview, and you went in depth to so many dimensions of these issues. So now let me turn things over to Catherine for her comments. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks so much to Brookings for organizing this event, especially just the week after the PIF leaders meeting, really timely. I think last week we saw, great examples of both Pacific unity, but also the effects of great power competition and what a lot of this external engagement is producing in the region as well. Also, big thanks to Joanne for that great presentation and providing us with so many great pieces of information to think and talk about. I thought I'd just have a couple thoughts on a couple of the points within that presentation, and then how this is being viewed or maybe viewed from the U.S. perspective. And how the U.S., some of the top concerns that the U.S. has with regard to Chinese activity across the Pacific Islands. So I think a lot of the concern, not just from the U.S., but from Australia and New Zealand and others, really comes down to Chinese intent in the region, right? And Joanne touched on this a little bit, talking about the strategic importance of the region for China and what the ambitions may be in the region. And there's a lot of back and forth on this. Are they looking to build out a base or not? How strategically important is the region truly to China in any sort of contingency within the Indo-Pacific? And I think the important thing to remember here is, as Joanne said, this is really a low cost, high yield place for the Chinese. And by that, I mean that even that uncertainty causes some pretty significant consternation for the US and others. And even a very small foothold or an airfield or a dual use port throughout the region, somewhere in the region, would significantly alter the calculus for the US and allies and partners in the case of any sort of contingency or military planning. And so that alone is reason for quite a bit of concern when it comes to the US, and why that we've seen so much heightened anxiety, I think, around the region. This is also the reason why the focus that China has had and some of the successes it's had in the policing and the security sectors have been so alarming. Obviously there's a lot of development need in the region, and there is a level of agency and an understanding that senior leaders are going to need to make pragmatic decisions for their people, especially when it comes to health, when it comes to environment and all these things. But when it comes to that security sector, that is an area that Australia certainly has been very focused on, the US as well, and others, because of the connectivity that it has to the potential to bring not just military personnel on the ground, but also that erosion of good governance that we see that happens when China comes in and starts mirroring its security sector and its security apparatus onto various Pacific islands. So as a counter to this, just going back briefly, the US has certainly hasn't always been the most reliable and the most consistent in our engagement in the Pacific. And I think that's that widely understood. I think as a really good example of that, going back to Joanne's slide where she put the diplomatic posts in the region, the next level of that is not just the actual embassies that we have in the region, the US versus others or Australia. It's the number of personnel on the ground, and kind of getting back to that idea of people and the people to people ties. Even where the US has an embassy, for example, in the Solomon Islands, we recently opened an embassy there during the last administration, and yet we only have 1 or 2 people on the ground versus, anywhere, depending on the reporting, between 10 to 30 Chinese diplomats plus others on the ground. And that's the same everywhere in the Pacific. The Chinese are vastly outnumbering the US and some of our other partners as well on the ground in diplomatic presence and having that outreach. Now, does that always translate into influence? As Joanne again pointed out, not necessarily, but quantity has a quality of its own, as often said in the DoD world, of course. So largely as a result of a lot of this increased Chinese interest, we've seen this ramp up of engagement from the US. Again, not always consistent, but definitely a ramp up started in the first Trump administration back in 2000, in the late 2000 teens, and then really accelerated through the Biden administration. However, in the last 6 months, with the rollback of US aid, with the withdrawal from the Paris climate agreements, with a lot of the other, with some of the tariff announcements for the region and the world, we've seen some of this engagement either come to a halt or be reversed in many ways. And so I would argue that we're in a really critical time for U.S. engagement and for the U.S. because those risks have not receded, right? In fact, if anything, they've amplified. And just I'll close out by just mentioning 2 areas that I think the U.S. Should be most keenly focused on when it comes to both opportunities we have to engage, but also some of the biggest challenges and risks to U.S. national security when it comes to Chinese engagement in the Pacific. First one is in that security space. And that includes, of course, for the Pacific, the maritime domain. This encompasses IUU illegal fishing challenges and unreported fishing challenges. This includes drug trafficking, a growing problem, especially in Melanesia. And it also wears away at a lot of the good governance, as we've discussed, across the region. And this is an area where the U.S. not only has a lot of knowledge and experience and capacity to potentially engage in the region, but also an area that we've seen the Trump administration has a lot of interest in, especially in that drug trafficking and criminal activity and transnational threats. So this is certainly an area that we could potentially be doubling down on, and an area that the U.S. needs to be particularly focused on working with partners and allies across the board. The second is there's a lot of conversation around the PIF, especially with the PIF leaders meeting this past week, potential fracturing of the PIF, tensions within the PIF when it comes to not just Taiwan and its engagement with the region, but also issues like deep sea mining, et cetera. I would argue that a lot of China's engagement in the region has been aimed at either dividing the Pacific Islands Forum, or working multilaterally or only bilaterally with certain members. And that is to the detriment of the region, because the Pacific Islands Forum certainly allows the Pacific to have a united face and a united front when engaging with external partners, including the US, but also most certainly China. And that is also in the US interest. And so supporting those regional pieces of architecture, supporting the regional forum is going to be in the US interest moving forward, and something that needs to remain in the forefront of US policymakers' minds. So I'll close out there. I know I'm tight on time and would love to hear what Patty has to say as well.
Thank you, Catherine. That was terrific. And I think you highlighted very well the U.S. perspective on these very critical issues. So let me turn to Patty, and hopefully she can then offer, a sense of what China is doing in the region, what are intentions, and so forth. Over to you, Patty.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Maria and Joanne. Congratulations on this really great presentation and body of research that you've built on the Pacific Islands. I think your effort to place China's aid and influence in context alongside other external players in the region is extremely valuable. It's useful for us to see the broader picture. I think what your research underscores to me about China's activities is that while there's a real drive for Beijing to present itself as a global provider of aid, loans, trade, and security, and while in Washington and other allied capitals, there's often a fixation on China's vastly expanded footprint across the diplomatic, economic, and security domains, which have indeed expanded significantly compared to where China was, say, 15 or 20 years ago. When you zoom out and place China's contributions in relative terms, the picture is more mixed. It's often the case that China is not always outspending, committing more resources, or wielding greater influence than Australia or the United States or other external actors in the region. I found your overview of China's security and military footprint in the region especially interesting, and particularly on the China-Solomon Islands relationship. When news broke in 2022 that China and the Solomon Islands had signed a security agreement, there was, as you noted, immediate speculation about, would this lead to a Chinese military base in the region? And as you note, this hasn't yet materialized, and instead we've seen activities like port visits, disaster relief cooperation, and so on. What really caught my eye at the time of when the text of the draft agreement was leaked was the reference to the fact that Beijing intended to send armed police, military personnel, and other law enforcement forces to assist the Solomon Islands in maintaining social order. So in an article that I wrote at the time for Brookings, I speculated whether this security agreement heralded a new era of Chinese security assistance. So was Beijing re-entering into the business of militarily propping up friendly leaders and regimes in power, which is something they haven't been doing since the Mao era during the Cold War days. And my conclusion then, and still is now, is that the real test would be in the implementation of the. So would Beijing's activities mirror those of other external powers like Australia? Would its focus be primarily on protecting Chinese citizens and property, or would it be something more? And based on your research, it seems like for now it's really the former. And thus far, China is largely keeping up the pace with other external actors like Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and the US, who also provide police assistance in the region. But as Catherine noted, even a small security foothold or footprint has significant implications, and certainly something that we need to continue to watch. A question that I have for you, Joanne, is do you think China will try to level up? Will we see a significant expansion in its security presence in this region in the medium to long term? My educated guess is that, at least perhaps not in the near term, given this region is not China's primary strategic theater. Its priority remains its immediate periphery, but I'd be curious to hear your views, Joanne, as well as Catherine's. And finally, as you note, Joanne, a host nation agency is critical, and it's clear that Pacific Islands, like many other small states, seek to diversify their external partners. They want to engage with as many major powers as possible to maximize their benefits and to prevent any one single actor from becoming too dominant. And this is, a very understandable impulse. The real risk, in my view, is when major powers disengage, choice diminishes, and smaller states feel that they have no choice but to align closely with China or whichever lone state is willing to provide attention and resources, and potentially compromising their independence. So that's the type of scenario that I fear. But for now, it seems like, as your research makes very clear, the Pacific Islands is a crowded and competitive space with robust diplomatic, economic, and security engagement from multiple actors. And this is the pluralism that provides important checks and balances. Of course, the open question is what happens if the United States' attention or Australia's attention and resources decline? This is a real concerning possibility, especially for the US, given the ongoing debates in Washington about whether the United States should prioritize, for instance, its own hemisphere, or whether it should continue to remain deeply engaged in the Indo-Pacific, given that it's a central theater of competition with China and a region that is vital to US interests. So let me end my comments here, and I will look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Patty. That was a really very interesting set of remarks. In particular, your last point that we focus so much on the Pacific Islands as a theater of intense geopolitical competition and tease out implications from that. But an equally challenging proposition would be disengagement from one of the great powers and the ensuing set of challenges that would come from that as well. So, we have limited time. We have only 20 minutes left, and I want to take this opportunity to bring all of you now and be able to interact with one another. And I have prepared some questions to trigger conversation, but because we also have a very engaged audience, I'm going to try to weave in some of the questions from the audience as I go along, because some of the themes that I had thought about were also, I think, very important for many of our members in the audience, and we have several questions on this. But and I'll highlight when some of these questions come directly from someone in the audience. And thanks for sending those questions. But let me start with allied coordination, because we've heard about the fact that there are several external actors that have a footprint in the region. We've heard about what security interests are at stake for Australia, for the United States. And what I would like to then engage in a conversation is, to what extent are the allies working in tandem? Do they have broad convergence when they identify key priorities in their Pacific Island strategy, or not? Because clearly there are geographical differences, there are differences in terms of historical ties. So I wonder if some of you could offer your views on how much are Australia and the United States doing together, when there have been high points of coordination, low points of coordination, and maybe to bring it to current developments. Are the Albanese and Trump administration telegraphing a desire to work together in the Pacific Islands or not? So maybe I'll start with Joanne and Catherine next.
Thank you. I think partner countries are a lot more conscious of the need to coordinate than perhaps they have been for a while. I think there's a recognition that no one country can do it all on its own, and that the best way that we're going to get outcomes that advance our interests is if we pool our resources and work together. I don't necessarily think that recognition has translated into on the ground implementation of that coordination. I was just in Solomon Islands a few weeks ago, and we had doing a workshop about Pacific Maritime Security Corporation, and different Pacific officials we had officials from across the region, and they were saying that partner countries still turn up in their country offering training on the same topic. New Zealand and Australia will turn up, 1 week after each other, offering training on the same topic, just things that should be very easily avoided. And it puts a huge burden on Pacific Island countries having to manage all these partners. We could be doing a lot more in Australia, the US, New Zealand, Japan, the UK, to better coordinate ourselves before we even turn up to offer that training. Say to New Zealand, well, we're offering this, what are you offering? And to do better. The Partners in the Blue Pacific Initiative that was announced in 2022 had the intent of achieving this, and there has been some movement in that regard. They have had different meetings, but I don't think that the old habits that are going to die, they're going to die hard, and I think we've still got a way to go.
Yeah, I'd agree with everything Joanne said, and I was also going to raise the Partners in the Blue Pacific. That was something that I helped put together when I was in government, and the impetus was certainly exactly as Joanne laid out, this recognition that not just was the need very great across the region, and no country can, cover everything, but also that there is increased interest from new partners. We had partners like, obviously Japan has been heavily involved in the region for some time, but growing interest there, even partners like South Korea, Canada, India, we had Germany interested in doing more, the EU. And so and that's great, right? To have more interest in engaging, but also at the same time, as Joanne aptly pointed out, these are very small bureaucracies, very small foreign ministries. If you have multiple visits by multiple countries offering potentially different competing mechanisms for example, maritime domain awareness, this not only overloads the system, but confuses the system, and it really has the opposite effect, right? So Partners in the Blue Pacific was put together in order to try and rectify that, right? Bringing partners together at the strategic level to try to coordinate and then inform the Pacific about what was available and what options were there. I do believe that those meetings are ongoing, but as Joanne said, I'm not sure that's translating down quite as much. I think there's also, some of this is on the Pacific as well. The Pacific Islands Forum has been doing a review of their regional architecture and the manner in which they engage with external partners. And so there has been some resistance when external partners engage with the Pacific Islands Forum. There's sort of hey, let us figure out how we want to engage first and develop this architecture, which I think is definitely the right approach. And yet that has also held things up a little bit. So certainly a lot of work is needed on both sides to ensure that this information translates all the way down. In terms of the current Trump administration, I haven't seen any indication that there's much focus on the Pacific at the moment. I think there hasn't been a translation really of what any sort of broader Indo-Pacific strategy will actually look like moving forward and where the Pacific fits into that. We've seen some bilateral engagement. The Deputy Secretary of State headed out to Papua New Guinea for the 50th anniversary celebration this week. And we've seen, obviously, there was the Cook Islands deep sea mining MOU or agreement between the Trump administration as well. But beyond that, we haven't seen a much engagement, and we certainly have not seen any specific activity between Australia and the US on the Pacific. Should Prime Minister Albanese and President Trump meet, they haven't yet. That could be on the agenda to discuss.
Wonderful. So, let me switch topics a little bit. And this question goes primarily to Patty, but then I welcome others joining as well. And the question is about climate change and China's diplomatic pull, because clearly climate change is an existential threat for Pacific Islands. And it's one area where the United States has retreated from climate mitigation efforts, while China has actually used the green transition as a calling card, so to speak, for its diplomacy. So, Patty, I was hoping that you could address what window of opportunity this creates for China, not just, of course, in the Pacific Islands, but more broadly. And I should mention that we had several questions from the audience on this topic. Some, for example, asked if we are exaggerating or underestimating China's leadership by using the green transition as, an area of, a landmark for a diplomatic initiative. And others wanted to help understand better the role of climate cooperation in China-Pacific Island cooperation arrangement. So how is China using the green transition to advance its diplomatic goals, and what is it doing in the region?
Well, Maria, thank you for this good question. I think generally speaking, we've certainly seen China try to position itself as a responsible global power, an advocate of the global South, of development, of climate issues. And this has become easier with the America First priorities of the Trump administration. Specifically on climate change, I think in May of this year at the China-Pacific Island Summit in Xiamen, China announced that it would increase support for Pacific Island countries on climate issues. I think it pledged to back 100 what it calls small but beautiful projects in the region over the next 3 years and provide assistance for climate resilience initiatives. Now, when you look at the actual numbers, I think it's pretty modest. For instance, the commitment on climate resilience assistance was $2 million, which is really small, especially compared to, I think it was something like the 850 or 60 billion US dollars that the United States announced in expanded programs and assistance for the Pacific Island countries back in 2022 during the first ever US Pacific Islands country summit in Washington. But in any case, I think it's this kind of engagement that allows China to reap a soft power win, to show that it's still committed to the region, even if it's nominal. And this does create a striking contrast with the United States which in general has cut back on global aid programs, has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, rolled back initiatives on climate risks and clean energy transition. So that, I think those are the optics. Of course, the reality is more complicated. China is far from the model or the global steward that it claims to be. And I think China has also its fair share of friction with Pacific Island countries over its heavy-handed tactics and pressure, especially when it comes to issues around Taiwan and its one China policy. But I think overall, Beijing can do less, but it can look like it's still doing something or doing more precisely because of how the United States is retreating on some of these issues.
Thank you, Fabian. Can I bring in Joanne and Catherine and on this issue of how are the Pacific Island countries responding to these developments on the climate agenda? And is there a possibility that Australia or others could step in and fulfill some of the roles that the United States had been playing in the climate change issue?
Pacific Island countries are pretty strategic in what issues they press with their partners. You will seldom hear a Pacific leader press China on climate, even though, as Patty said, China is by no means sort of got clean hands on climate change, just like my own country doesn't. But they seldom press the United States either, because I think they calculate which countries are likely to it's likely to have an impact on, and which countries are likely just to ignore them. So Australia gets pressed very strongly on climate change. And, the Pacific Islands Forum leaders meeting last week, we did get, again, endorsement from Pacific leaders to host the next COP if we manage to succeed in the negotiations with Turkey. But, at the same time, a lot of concern about the fact that Australia continues to approve massive resource projects. So I think Pacific Island countries are very clever about what issues they press and how hard they press them. In the Pacific, Australia does a lot on climate, and Australia has stepped in. So when the USAID was folded and a lot of the US's aid programs were ended in the Pacific, Australia dedicated an extra $400 million Australian to the region to try to fill those gaps. That's not sustainable probably in the long term, and it would be great if the US, as it goes through its review of its aid program, would perhaps direct some aid back to the Pacific, because we won't be able to keep plugging the gaps indefinitely. But for the time being, we have attempted to, but that's been by necessity, and I don't think something that we would want to keep doing in the long term.
Yeah, 3 quick points to add here. First, I think it's important to remember that the U.S. Is not the biggest donor in the Pacific. In fact, by far, I think we're the 5th after Australia, New Zealand, Japan, China, and then the U.S. So it's not as if, the pullout of U.S. aid and the retreat on climate certainly major impacts, and certainly have had some tangible negative effects on the ground for people and their lives. But just to keep that in context. In terms of Australia being able to step in, as Joanne said, they already have in many ways. New Zealand's also looked at areas to plug the gaps. I think for the most part, in the short term, yes, possible. The one caveat to that would be in the North Pacific. The U.S., as of now, is still planning to follow through on, and doesn't seem to be any risk to the Compacts of Free Association agreements that we have with Palau, RMI, and FSM, which basically give the U.S. Unilateral defense access across the North Pacific, but also confer extensive economic benefit to those countries. If that were to roll back or stop, that would be a complete game changer. And I think, and that's very top of mind, I think, for our Australian colleagues, especially, is that would be almost impossible for them to fill the gap on. The third point I'd like to make is just that while all of that may be true in terms of the U.S. not being one of the bigger donors in the region, however, what this retreat and the climate rollback, and as well as the closure of U.S. aid and the tariffs, what I would argue they have done is put a lot more legitimacy behind the messaging that China has had for quite some time about China being the global stabilizer, the reliable partner, US being the destabilizer, China being the supporter of global norms, we're now seeing that be a little more echoed, right, across the region. After the tariff announcement, we had Prime Minister Marape talking about, very diplomatically saying, the US is going to do what the US is going to do, but we'll have to look to other partners that show us respect economically, including China. And so that, to me, is the more troubling outcome from a lot of these rollbacks.
Thank you, Catherine. Time is running. We have so many topics, but probably we'll have time for just one last question. And we've covered diplomacy, we covered climate change, we covered how this is also affecting the information ecosystem, the narratives that it supports or undermines. And I want to talk a little bit about hard power, which is another dimension of Joanne's presentation today. And I think it was a very good point in, talking about the challenges that China has faced in increasing its military presence in the region, and the fact that so far no base has materialized. But obviously that just the intent of doing so creates, of course, deep concerns. But Joanne, I remember that you mentioned in your presentation that one of the sources of reassurance, if you will, for Australia of any increased Chinese military presence in the region is, of course, the AUKUS partnership and the fact that nuclear-powered submarines will be delivered in the future by the United States. But Catherine, I wanted to ask about the fact that the Pentagon has started a review of AUKUS. What is motivating that? When can we have some clarity on what that would mean? And then bring Patty and Joanne on how China or Australia may be reading these a new conversation on the fate of AUKUS.
Yeah, and of course, a lot to go into there, but I'll try to keep this brief. Bottom line, we don't have a lot of clarity yet on when any sort of review would be released. There may not be an official review released publicly. We do know that there's an internal review happening, and we do know that right, the UK and Australia have already conducted their own internal reviews as well. So that in and of itself is not unprecedented. I think the concern was around Bridge Colby's leading of that review and some of the messaging that he's put out in the past on lack of support for AUKUS and questioning the importance of AUKUS. That all said, we've had Secretary Rubio kind of give some cautiously optimistic words on where that review might be headed. President Trump himself had positive things to say about AUKUS after meeting with Prime Minister Starmer. So all in all, I'm cautiously optimistic that AUKUS itself will continue. Now there may be some revamping of some of the pieces of that. And again, I won't go into the details, but there's certainly areas where there's challenges to AUKUS, right? Personnel, numbers of subs coming out, the coordination, the technical collaboration between the countries. And so there's a lot of areas there where there can be some revisions and stepping up and moving forward. And so maybe the review will have some positive outcomes in that way as well. But overall, don't have a whole lot of clarity on when and if that is coming out publicly.
Thank you, Catherine. And sorry to ask such a big question and leave you, Patty and Joanne, 1 minute each, but that's about the time we have. So any reflections on this? Patty, I'll go to you first.
Just briefly, Maria, I think, China wants to see, bottom line, a U.S. pullback from the Indo-Pacific region. And I think injecting uncertainty around AUKUS and where it stands really does not send the right signals to Beijing. And so I think the fact that Catherine noted, it's still TBD, nothing's been determined, is perhaps, better news than that the AUKUS agreement may be put on hold or maybe, completely changed. But I do think that it's going to be a litmus test for signaling U.S. interests and commitment in working with allies and partners to maintain and enhance deterrence, where sort of the fate of the AUKUS pact lands.
Thank you. Joanne, last word?
Yeah, just quickly, AUKUS has really become wrapped up in broader questions about the US alliance in Australia. So I think if it were to fall over or if there were to be a significant change to it that to Australia's detriment, the voices that have been questioning the US alliance would get a lot of power in their arms, and it might change a little bit of the way that Australia thinks about the world. and thinks about the United States. So I very much hope that it doesn't it doesn't fall over, because our whole government infrastructure at the moment is directed towards AUKUS happening. It's operating under the assumption that the AUKUS submarines will arrive. And if they don't, it will need a major reorientation of Australian defence and foreign policy thinking, and some serious questions that people will start to really ask in a very pressing way about the continuation of the US-Australia alliance. And that then has flow-on effects for the whole region.
Well, thank you so much. So, there were so many other questions I wanted to get into. I think that this signals the richness of the topic, the importance of paying attention to the Pacific Islands. And I appreciate very much you sharing your insights with us today. And I appreciate the audience for tuning in. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day or night.